And once we have covered the spread operator, now let's talk about the rest operator. And no, you're not hallucinating. You're seeing the same syntax with three dots. But rest operator is doing the opposite, where instead of spreading the values essentially by just splitting them up and copying, we're gonna be gathering values using rest operator. And I think it's gonna be the easiest if we start looking at the examples right away, because I fully understand that it might be confusing how these same three dots can behave one way where we're using the spread and then the other way when we're using the rest operator. So let's right away start looking at examples because this is going to give us the best clue. And I can tell you right away that we're going to use a rest operator in two situations. One, when we're going to be destructuring arrays or objects, and second, when we're going to be gathering the parameters in the function. And first, let's start by destructuring. And remember, when we talked about destructuring, we had an array, and then array had three items. And then if we wanted to destructure the first one, we just come up with whatever name, and then of course we assign it to our array. Also remember how when we talked about it, I said that what happens with orange and lemon? And the answer was nothing, because we're not accessing, correct? So what we can do with a rest operator when we're destructuring, I could just say, you know what, get me the rest of the items in the array. Now that could be one item, that could be 5,000. It doesn't matter. If I'm getting the first item here with a value first, so of course that is my variable. After that, I'm going to get all the items. So the way it works is I'm going to pass comma, then dot, 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 and then whatever name you would want. Now, most common convention is going to be adding here rest, but you can also do random. You can also do banana. It doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to go with the rest, and you're going to see that in the console, if I add a comma, I'm going to have two things. I'm going to have apple, which is my first item, and then I have whatever items I have in here. So in this case, even if I'm going to add more items, then of course my array is going to increase because the rest of the items are right now bigger. Since we're accessing only the first item, we're assigning it to a variable of first, but then rest of the items are collected in the array. And with that array, you can do whatever you would want. You want to use map method, use the map method. You want to use filter, you can do whatever your heart pleases with the rest of the array. Now, what happens if we destructure more? If, let's say, I'm not only looking for the first, but also for the second, well, then I'm going to assign the orange to a second. And now my rest array is going to be smaller. Then I'm just going to get lemon, banana, as well as pear. Now, we also can do the same thing with objects, where I have the person object, and it has a name, last name, and job. And remember, when we destructured, we looked for, again, properties. However, the difference between the arrays and objects was the fact that we needed to look for proper property name. So the key name needed to match in order to access the property. And in this case, I'm looking for the job. And again, the answer is what happens to the rest of the properties? Nothing, because we're not accessing. However, we already know that we can use the rest operator. So let's try it out. Again, we're going to have a comma, rest, and let's see what we're going to get in the console. Now, in this case, notice how the identifier rest has been already declared. So we need to be careful when we're using rest. Make sure that, of course, you use a different name. So you cannot use rest, rest, rest all over your project. In this case, we're going to probably say, I don't know, fruits. And once I change the name for my rest, of course, I also need to change it in a console. So let's write fruits. And now everything works as expected. Now, if we're going to console log the rest right below the object, we can see that the rest is gathering the rest of the properties that we have in the structure. So if we destructure job, then we're going to get name and last name. If we're going to destructure, let's say here, name, then of course we're going to get a job and a last name. However, please keep in mind that in this case, when we're using it for destructuring, the actual placement matters. So don't place dot, dot, dot rest in front of the job. I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to copy and paste. I'm going to comment, and now I'm going to delete, and then we're going to look for comma job. And you're going to see that there's going to be a big fat error where JavaScript is going to complain and say rest element must be the last element. So if you're gathering rest of the properties from the object, you need to make sure that the rest operator is the last one. The same goes for arrays, because otherwise it doesn't make sense, correct? We use the spread operator to copy the values. So in this case, if you would want to access all the rest of the items from the array, we need to place it all the way at the end. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense, and then there's going to be a big fat error. So I'm going to leave it for your reference. And we're going to go back to getting the job property and then a rest of the properties from the object. And the second place where we're going to use a REST operator is collecting the parameters when we're passing in the function. And this is going to be very, very interesting, where you need to keep in mind that REST operator is when we're talking about the parameters of the function. Our spread operator that we already covered in the previous video when we talked about math max function and our own function is when we're passing in as an argument. Again, very, very important. REST operator for parameters and then spread operator for the argument. And my function is going to be following, where I'm going to say get average, const get average. Of course, I'm going to use the arrow function since we already covered it, average, like so. And then this is going to be the function that takes two things. It's going to take a name, so name here. And then the second one is going to be average scores. So we're going to calculate average scores. So we would probably want to get some kind of score values. Now that could be 5 score values. That could be, again, 3,000 score values. So how can we set this up? Well, I could say dot, 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 and then whatever name I would want. So in my case, I'm going to go with scores. Then within the function, first, we're just going to console log. Just so we're all on the same page. I'm going to copy and paste my console log. And then I'm going to look for my REST operator by the name of scores. Now let's invoke it. And we're going to go with get average. And now I would want to pass in the name of John and then whatever values I would want for my scores. So let's look for person.name and then let's come up with whatever values you would want. So 78, 90, I don't know, 56, as well as 43. So those are going to be my test scores. Now it happens in the console. And you know what? By the way, I'm going to comment this out because again, our console is getting quite busy, but I can see that I'm accessing the name, which of course is my first parameter. And then using the REST operator, I'm gathering rest of the parameters and I'm gathering nicely in the array. So now I can do whatever I would want with this array. So we can technically calculate our average score. Of course, there's many ways how we can do that. Since it is array, we can, by the way, use the reduce method or anything we would like. But since we just covered for of loop, why don't we do it using the for of loop? I'm going to come up with new variable. I'm going to call this total. Total is going to be equal to 0. Then let's set up our for of loop. We're going to go with const score. That's going to be our single instance of. And then, of course, I'm looking for the scores. That is my REST operator. And then what I would want is total plus, and then whatever is the score. And then once we're done with our loop, then we're going to come up with console log, where we're going to use a template string. And we're just going to write a name. So we're going to access our name argument. So let's use $name, then John's average score, and we're going to go with total. So let's access our total variable and then divide by scores, and we're looking for length. So let's go with length. And this should give us in a console that the average score for John is 66.75. And again, the key here is that I don't know how many arguments I'm going to have here. I can have 4, I can have 2, I can have 3. It doesn't matter. What happens is that using the REST operator, I'm going to gather all of them, and then I can decide whatever functionality I would want. Now, let me throw you a mind grenade, where if we're using, of course, the REST operator, we're talking about the parameters, but we can also set up the spread operator when we're passing in as an argument, correct? So just to show you the difference, I'm going to come up with some kind of array, and I'm going to call this test scores, and then I'm going to pass in some kind of values. So I'm just going to copy and paste these values here, and then let's add, I don't know, 99, and then maybe, I don't know, 65. Let's save that. And of course, we can call the function one more time, or in this case, I'm going to use the spread operator when I'm passing it as an argument. How it works? Well, I could just say dot, 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 and then I'm looking for my test scores array. And again, this is the difference. When you're talking about REST operator, you're talking about the parameters. So when you're setting up the functionality, how you're going to handle parameters. Now, when you're using the spread operator, you're talking about when you're passing it as an argument, because you have the array, but instead of passing it as array, you're passing it as each individual item. That's what you do here. We do dot, 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 and we spread them out item by item. And of course, within the function declaration, that's where we work with our REST operator, where we gather them back up, and then we decide what we would want to do. And in this case, we're just calculating the average score. So that would be the use case for REST operator. Again, we're going to use it for the structuring. We're going to use it when we're dealing with function parameters. And as far as the structuring, please keep in mind that the location where you place the REST operator is important. If you're going to place it in the front, you're going to have an error.